calm, intimate, restrained. Not every nightmare happens in sleep. Some of the most frightening ones unfold in broad daylight, when the world still appears intact, but something inside the mind has already begun to crack. What makes psychological collapse so terrifying is not its volume, but its intimacy. It arrives quietly, through a rigid smile, an unfocused stare, a strange pause in front of a mirror, the sudden inability to feel certain that the self still belongs to itself. There are regions within the human mind that we spend entire lives avoiding: buried memories, disowned impulses, unnamed longings, muted grief, the private terror of never being enough. Under pressure, isolation, trauma, perfectionism, addiction, or unbearable self-consciousness, these hidden regions can begin to surface, not all at once, slowly, quietly, until there is nothing left to hold on to. Calm, cinematic, restrained. That is why the most disturbing mental breakdowns in cinema do not simply portray madness as spectacle. They let us feel the slow internal betrayal of the mind itself. They move through fractures in identity, reality, memory, and self-recognition, forcing us to confront the possibility that the greatest horror may not be external at all. It may be the moment when the machinery that once held experience together begins to turn against the person living inside it. Black Swan captures that intimacy with terrifying precision. The film does not need a killer, because Nina is already being destroyed by an ideal, cast as both the white swan and the black swan. She is pushed into conflict with everything she has repressed: desire, aggression, sensuality, imperfection, independence. What makes her breakdown so unsettling is not only the hallucinations, but the way they emerge from psychological pressure that feels horribly coherent, calm, cinematic, restrained. Nina's collapse does not arrive like an explosion. It bleeds through sleeplessness, through mirrors, through shame, through the impossible demand that she remain pure while also becoming wild. The doubles she sees are not arbitrary horrors. They are the visual form of a self-splitting under the strain of contradiction. Every glance at her reflection becomes a negotiation with a version of herself she cannot admit, yet can no longer suppress. And that is what makes Black Swan so devastating. Nina's triumph is inseparable from her destruction. She reaches the state of total embodiment she craves only by sacrificing the psychological boundaries that once held her together. Her perfection is real, but it is inseparable from self-annihilation. The film reveals the violence hidden inside ideals that ask a person to amputate parts of themselves in order to deserve love, excellence, or transcendence. Calm, cinematic, restrained. If Black Swan is breakdown through perfection and repression, Jacob's ladder is breakdown through trauma and dissociation. The film is not terrifying because it shows monsters. It is terrifying because it destroys the conditions under which reality can still feel reliable. Jacob is not simply haunted, he is dislocated. Time, memory, death, guilt, and identity all begin bleeding into one another until he can no longer find a stable ground from which to say what is real. That is why the film feels less like conventional horror than like a prolonged spiritual emergency. Jacob is not investigating a mystery. He is trying to locate himself inside a consciousness that can no longer separate dream from memory, afterlife from hallucination, suffering from revelation. The grotesque imagery matters, but only because it externalizes a deeper exhaustion. His mind is not merely disturbed. It is incapable of settling back into the shape of ordinary life. Calm, cinematic, restrained. The Shining takes a different path. shows how isolation can become a solvent. Jack Torrance is frightening, not because he begins as a monster, but because he begins as something more recognizable, a person still trying to believe he can recover meaning, restore dignity, and rebuild himself. Yet the silence of the Overlook Hotel amplifies every weakness he already carries: resentment, failure, frustration, entitlement, rage, until the boundaries between environment and psyche collapse. What makes Jack's breakdown so haunting is how ordinary its roots are. He is not simply possessed by supernatural forces. He is slowly reorganized by solitude, by wounded pride, by the echo chamber of his own mind. The endless corridors, the repeating patterns, the impossible spaces, and the quiet hum of the hotel all seem to mirror the recursive logic of a consciousness, folding inward on itself. The haunting works because the mind was already vulnerable to being haunted. Calm, cinematic, restrained. If The Shining is breakdown through isolation, Requiem for a Dream is breakdown through craving. The film understands that collapse often begins in repetition. A pill, a hit, a ritual, a habit performed often enough that it begins to replace the self. What makes the film unbearable is not merely what addiction does to the body, but what it does to desire. It rewrites what people hope for. It narrows the world until all meaning flows toward the next moment of relief. The characters in Requiem for a Dream are not monsters or moral examples. They are painfully human. Sarah wants beauty, attention, transformation, some final proof that life has not forgotten her. Harry, Marion, and Tyrone want escape, love, possibility, a future less suffocating than the one they inhabit. The tragedy is that the mind can become loyal to the very thing that is destroying it, because destruction so often arrives disguised as comfort. Calm, cinematic, restrained. That is why the breakdowns here are so humiliating and intimate. They are not grand tragedies descending from the sky. They are accumulations. The self narrows. The imagination dries up. Relationships become instrumental. By the time the characters understand what has happened, their interior lives have already been rewritten by obsession. What remains is not freedom, but ritualized need. Then Senegdosh, New York, brings us to perhaps the quietest and most devastating form of collapse: the breakdown produced by consciousness itself becoming too heavy to carry. Caden Kotar is not losing his mind in a theatrical way. He is being crushed by over-awareness, by the impossible desire to fully capture and understand existence. He turns life into an endless interpretive project, and in doing so, loses the ability to simply inhabit it. Slow, reflective, quiet. This is what makes the film so disturbing. Its breakdown looks intellectual on the surface, but underneath is a profound erosion of selfhood. Time slips, roles multiply, identity blurs. Caden keeps building larger systems to hold reality still. But each attempt only proves that reality cannot be fixed in place without being hollowed out. His problem is not that he cannot think deeply enough. It is that thought itself has become a mechanism of estrangement. Placed beside one another, these films reveal different routes toward the same abyss. Black Swan shows the self torn apart by perfection. Jacob's Ladder shows the self displaced by trauma. The Shining shows the self devoured by isolation and resentment. Requiem for a Dream shows the self reorganized by craving. Senegdosh, New York shows the self exhausted by consciousness. Different languages, different aesthetics. Same terrifying question. What remains when the mind can no longer be trusted to keep identity coherent? Slow, reflective, quiet. That may be why mental breakdowns in cinema disturb us more deeply than many traditional horrors. A monster can remain outside us. A ghost can still suggest distance. But a breakdown leaves nowhere clean to stand. These films do not frighten us only with what their characters see. They frighten us with what their characters become, unable to hold together inside themselves. And because every human being lives inside the fragile architecture of perception, memory, feeling, and self-recognition, these stories never stay safely fictional for long. Perhaps that is the deepest reason they linger. A mind does not always break through invasion. Sometimes it breaks through its own habits, desires, defenses, dreams, and private wounds, which means the final horror is not only that collapse is possible, it is that collapse